The following story is Thrawn by Robert Louis Stevenson. As with many of the other stories from Scotland, much of this tale is in Scots, so my apologies for any mispronunciations. Thrawn. The Reverend Murdoch Soulis was long minister of the moorland parish of Balwearie in the Vale of Jewel. A severe, bleak-faced old man, dreadful to his hearers, he dwelt in the last years of his life without relative or servant or any human company, in a small and lonely manse under the hanging shore. In spite of the iron composure of his features, his eye was wild, scared, and uncertain, and when he dwelt in private admonitions on the future of the impenitent, it seemed as if his eye pierced through the storms of time to the terrors of eternity. Many young persons coming to prepare themselves against the season of the Holy Communion were dreadfully affected by his talk. He had a sermon on 1 Peter verse 8, the devil as a roaring lion, on the Sunday after every 17th of August, and he was accustomed to surpass himself upon that text both by the appalling nature of the matter and the terror of his bearing in the pulpit. The children were frightened into fits, and the old looked more than usually oracular, and were all that day full of those hints that Hamlet deprecated. The manse itself, where it stood by the water of Jewel among some thick trees, with a shore overhanging it on the one side, and on the other many cold moorish hilltops rising towards the sky, had begun at a very early period of Mr. Soulis's ministry to be avoided in the dusk hours by all who valued themselves upon their prudence. The Gidmen sitting at the Clachan ale-house shook their heads together at the thought of passing late by that uncanny neighbourhood. There was one spot, to be more particular, which was regarded with especial awe. The manse stood between the high road and the water of Jewel, with a gable to each. Its back was towards the kirk town of Balwearie. Nearly half a mile away, in front of it, a bare garden, hedged with thorn, occupied the land between the river and the road. The house was 2 stories high, with 2 large rooms on each. It opened not directly on the garden, but on a causewayed path or passage, giving on the road on the one hand, and closed on the other by the tall willows and elders that bordered on the stream. And it was this strip of causeway that enjoyed among the young parishioners of Balwearie so infamous a reputation. The minister walked there often after dark, sometimes groaning aloud in the instancy of his unspoken prayers, and when he was from home and the manse door was locked, the more daring schoolboys ventured with beating hearts to follow my leader across the legendary spot. This atmosphere of terror, surrounding as it did a man of God of spotless character and orthodoxy, was a common cause of wonder and subject of inquiry among the few strangers who were led by chance or business into that unknown outlying country. But many even of the people of the parish were ignorant of the strange events which had marked the first year of Mr. Soulis's ministrations, and among those who were better informed, some were naturally reticent, and others shy of that particular topic. Now and again only, one of the older folk would warm into courage over his 3rd tumbler, and recount the cause of the minister's strange looks and solitary life. 50 years sin, when Mr. Soulis came first into Balwearie, he was still a young man, a callant, the folk said, for book learning and grand at the exposition, but as was natural in say young a man, with nae livid experience in religion. The younger sort were greatly taken with his gifts and his garb, but old, concerned, serious men and women were moved even to prayer for the young man, whom they took to be a self-deceiver, and the parish that was like to be sail supplied. It was before the days of the moderates, weary for them, but ill things are like gid, they baith come bit by bit, a pickle at a time, and there were folk even then that said the Lord had left the college professors to their own devices, and the lads that went to study with him would have done mair and better sitting in a peat bog like their forebears of the persecution, with a Bible under their oxter and a spirit of prayer in their heart. There is nae doubt, anyway, but that Mr. Soulis had been now long at the college. He was careful and troubled for many things beside the ae thing needful. He had a feck of books with him, mair than ever had been seen before in the presbytery, and a sair work the carrier had with him, for they were alike to have smaller than the Dale's Hag between this and Kilmackley. They were books of divinity, to be sure, or so they ca'd them, but the serious were opinion that there was little service for sae many, when the hail of God's word would gang in the neuk of a plaid. Then he would sit half the day and half the nicht forby, which was scant decent, writing nae less. And first they were feared he would read his sermons, and sin it was proved he was writing a book himself, which was surely no fitting for one of his years and sma' experience. Anyway, it behoved him to get an old decent wife to keep the manse for him, and see to his bit dinners, and he was recommended to an old limmer, Janet McClure they ca'd her, and so far left to himself as to be overpersuaded. There was many advised him to the contraire, for Janet was mair than suspected by the best folk in Balwearie. Lang o' that, she had had a whean towards a goon. She hadn't come for it for maybe 30 year, and Bairns had seen her mumbling to herself upon Keys Loam in the gloaming, what was an unco time and place for a God-fearing woman. Howsoever it was the laird himself that had first told the minister of Janet, and in their days he would have gone a far gate to pleasure the laird. When folk told him that Janet was sib to the deil, it was a superstition by his way of it, and when they cast up the Bible to him and the witch of Endor, he would threep it down their thrapples that their days were agone by, and the deil was mercifully restrained. Well, when it got about the clacking that Janet McClure was to be servant at the manse, the folk were fair mad with her and him together, and some of the goodwives had nae better to do than to get round her door cheeks and charge her with it that was kent against to charge her with that was kent against her, for the Sodger's bairn to John Thompson's too clean. She was nae great speaker, folk usually let her gang ain gate, and she let them gang theirs, when either fair good e'en and a fair good day. But when she was buckled to, she had a tongue to deave the miller. Up she got, and there wasn't an old study in Balwearie, but she got somebody lout for it that day. They couldn't say anything, but she would say teat it, till at the hind end the guidwives up and caught hand of her, and clawed the coats off her back, and pushed her down the clack into the water duel to see if she was a witch or no, swim or drown. The carline skirled till ye could hear her at the hanging shore, and she fought like 10. There was many a goodwife by the mark of her next day, and many a long day after. And just in the headest of the colours hanging, what should come up for his sins but the new minster. Woman, he said, and he had a grand voice, I charge you in the Lord's name to let her go. Janet ran to him. She was fair wood with terror, and clung to him and prayed him, for Christ's sake, save her for the comers. And they, for their part, told him that was Kent, and maybe mair. Woman, says he to Janet, is this true? The Lord sees me, says she, as the Lord made me, no word it. For by the bairn, says she, I've been a decent woman all my days. Will you, said Mr. Soulis, in the name of God and before me, his unworthy minister, renounce the devil and his works? Well, it would appear that when he asked it that, she gave a grin that fairly fricked them that saw her, as they could hear her teeth play dull together in her shafts. But there was nothing for it but the a way or the other, and Janet lifted up her hand and renounced the devil before them all. And now, said Mr. Soulis to the goodwives, home with you, one and all, and pray to God for his forgiveness. And he gave his arm to Janet, though she had little on her but a sack, and took her up the clack and ta'en door like the lady of the land, and her screeing and laughing as was a scandal to be heard. There was many grave folk lang over their prayers that night, but when the morn came, there was sic a fear fell upon Balwearie that the bairns hid themselves, and in the men folk stood and kicked frae their doors. For there was Janet, coming down the clachan, her or her likeness none could tell, with her neck thrawn, and her head on one side, like a body that had been hanged, and a girn on her face like an unstreaked corp. By and by they got used to it, and e'en spirited to ken what was wrong, but frae that day forth she couldn't speak like a Christian woman, but slaved and played click with her tongue like a pair of shears, and frae that day forth the name of God came now on her lips. Well, she would try to say it, but it michtna be. Them that kenned best said least, but they ne'er give that thing the name of Janet McClure. For the old Janet, by their way was in muckle hell that day. But the minister was neither to hard nor to bind. He preached about nothing but the folk's cruelty that had gi'e her a stroke of the palsy. He skulped the bairns that meddled her, and he had her up to the manse that same night, and dwelled there eyes lane with her under the hanging shore. Well, time goodbye, and the idler sort commenced to think mair likely of that black business. The minister was well thought of. He was aye late at the writing. Folk would see his candle doon by the dual water after 12 at e'en, and he seemed pleased with himself, and up sitting as at first, though body could see he was dwaning. As for Janet, she came and she gaed. If she didn't speak muckle afore, it was reason she should speak less then. She meddled naebody, but she was an eldritch thing to see, and none would have mistrysted her wi' her for Balwearie gleb. About the end of July there came a spell of weather, the like it now was in the country. It was lown and het and heartless. The herds kidney win up the Black Hill, the bairns were weariest to play, and yet it was ghosty too, with claps of het wind that rumbled in the glens, and bits of showers that sluckered nothing. We aye thucked it but to thunder in the morning, but the morn came, and the morn's morning, and it was aye the same uncanny weather, sair on folks and bestial. Of a' that were, none suffered like Mr. Soulis. He could neither sleep nor eat. He told his elders, and when he wasna writing at his weary book, he would be stravaging our countryside like a man possessed, when a body else was blithe to keep Caleb in the house. Abune hanging shore in the bield of Black Hill, there's a bit enclosed ground with an iron yet, and it seems in the old days there was a kirkyard of Balweary, consecrated by the papists before the blessed light shone upon the kingdom. It was a great hoe for Mr. Soulis's anyway. There he would sit and consider his sermons, and indeed it's a buildy bit. Well, as he came over the west end of the Black Hill one day, he saw first two, and sin four, and sin 7 corbett crows flying around and about the old kirkyard. They flew low and heavy, and squawked to there as they gaed, and it was clear to Mr. Soulis that something had put them frae their ordinary. He wasn't easy flayed, and gaed straight up to the wares, and what should he find there but a man, or the appearance of a man, sitting in the inside upon a grave. He was of a great stature, and black as hell, and his eyen was singular to see. Mr. Soulis had heard tell of black men many's the time, but there was something unco about this black man that daunted him. Het as he was, he took a kind of cold grew in the marrow of his bones, but he spak for all that, and says he, "My friend, are you a stranger in this place?" The black man answered ne'er a word. He got upon his feet, and began to histle to the wa on the far side, but he looked at the minister, and the minister stood and looked back, till in a minute the black man was o'er the wall, and rinning for the bield of the trees. Mr. Soulis, he hardly kenned why, ran after him, but he was sair for jasket with his walk, and the het unwholesome weather, and marin as he licked he get nae mair than a glisk of the black man among the birks, till he won down to the foot of the hillside, and there he saw him once mair, going hap, step, and loop, by dual water to the manse. Mr. Soulis wasna well pleased that this fearsome gangrel should make so free with Balweary manse, and he ran the harder, and wet shoon o'er the burn and up the walk, but the dale a black man was there to see. He stepped out on the road, but there's naebody there. He gaed o'er the garden, but nae black man. At the hinder end, and a bit feared as was but natural, he lifted the hasp and into the manse, and there was Janet McClure before his een, wi' Thrawn Craig, and none so pleased to see him. And he aye minded since sin, when first he set his eyen upon her, he had the same cold and deadly grew. "Janet," says he, "have you seen a black man?" "Black man?" quoth she. "Sae sal. You know wise, minster, there's nae black man in our Balweary." But she didn't speak plain, you mun understand, but yammered like a pony with the bit in its moo. "Well," says he, "Janet, if there was nae black man, I have spoken with the accuser of the brethren." And he sat down like one wi' a fever, and his teeth chattered in his head. "Hoots," said she, "bring shame to yourself, minster," and gied him a dreep brandy that she kept out her. So Mr. Soulis gaed in his study among his backs. It's a lang, lie, mirk chamber, perishing cold in winter, and no very dry in the tap of the summer, for the man stands near the burn. So down he sat, and thought of all that had gone on. It had come and gone since he was in Balweary, and his home, and the days when he was a bairn and ran daffing on the braes, and that black man aye ran in his head like the overcome of a song. Eh, the mair he thought to the black man. He tried the prayer, and the words wouldn't come to him, and he tried, they say, to write at his book, but he could nae make any more of that. There was whiles he thought the black man was at his oxter, and the swat stood upon him, cold as well water, and there was other whiles when he came to himself like a christened bairn and minded nothing. The upshot was that he gaed to the window and stood glowering at the water. The trees are unco thick, and the water lies deep and black under the manse, and there was Janet, washing the clays with her coats kilted. She had her back to the minister, and he, for his part, hardly kenned what he was looking at. Since she turned round and showed her face, Mr. Soulis had the same cold grew as twice the day afore, and it was borne in upon him what folks said, that Janet was dead long sin, and there was a boggle in her clay-cold flesh. He drew back a pickle and he scanned her narrowly. She was tramping in the clays, crooning to herself. And good guide us, but it was a fearsome face. While she sang louder, but there was no man born a woman that could tell the words of her song. And while she looked sidelong down, there was nothing there for her to look at. They gave a scanner through the flesh upon his bones, and there was hen's advertisement. But Mr. Soulis just blamed himself, he said, to think ill of a poor old afflicted wife that hadn't a friend for by himself. And he put up a bit prayer for him and her, and drank a little callow water. But his heart rose again the meat, and gaed up to his naked bed in the gloaming. There was a night that has ne'er been forgotten in Balwearie, that night to the 17th of August, 1712. It had been het before, as I said, but that night it was hetter than ever. The sun gaed down among unco-looking clouds. It fell as mirk as the pit. No a star, no a breath of wind. You couldn't see your hand afore your face. And even the old folk kissed the covers frae the beds and lay pitching for the breath. With all that he had upon his mind, it was gay and unlikely Mr. Soulis would get muckle sleep. He lay and he told the good calla bed that he got into brunt his very banes. Whiles he slept and whiles he wakened, whiles he heard the time of nicht and whiles the tykes wheowling up the muir, and as somebody was dead. Whiles he thought he heard boggles clavering in his lug, whiles he saw spunkies in the room. He behoved, he judged to be sick, and sick he was. It laid loose the sickness. At the hinder end he got a clearness in his mind, sat up in his sark on the bedside, and fell thinking once more of the black man and Janet. He couldn't well tell how, maybe it was the card at his feet, but it was came in upon him with a spit that there was some connection between their two, and that either or both of them were boggles. But just at that moment, in Janet's room, which was next to his, there came a stamp of feet as if men were whistling, then a loud bang, and when a wind gied rustling round the four quarters of the house, and the now was once more as silent as grave. Mr. Soulis was feared for neither man nor devil. He got his tinder box, lit a candle, made 3 steps over to Janet's door. It was on the hasp, and he pushed it open, and keeked baldly in. It was a big room, as big as the minister's inn, and plenished with grand, old, solid gear, for he had nothing else. There was a four-posted bed with old tapestry, and a braw cabinet of oak, that was for the minister's divinity books, and put there to be out of the gate. Now in duds of Janet's lying there and there upon the floor. But nae Janet could Mr. Soulis see, nor any sign of a contention. In he gaed, and there's few that would have followed him, and looked around and listened. But there was nothing to be heard, neither inside the manse nor in our Balwearie parish, and nothing to be seen but the muckle shadows turning round the canal. And then, all at once, the minister's heart played dunt and stood stock still, and a cold wind blew among the hairs of his head. What a weary sight was that for a poor man's een? But there was Janet, hanging for a nail beside the old oak cabinet. A head lay on her shoulder, her een was steeked, the tongue projected frae her mouth, and her heels, with 2 feet clear upon the floor. God forgive us all, thought Mr. Soulis. Poor Janet's dead. He came a step nearer to the corpse, and when his heart failed, wumbled in his inside, by what cantrip it would ill beseem a man to judge, she was hanging for a single nail, and by a single worsted thread for damned hose. It was an awful thing to be laying at night to second prodigies of darkness, but Mr. Soulis was strong in the Lord. He turned and gaed his ways out of the room, and locked that door ahint him, and step by step down the stairs as heavy as lead, and set down the candle on the table at the stair's foot. He couldn't pray, he couldn't think. He was dreeping with cold sweat, and nothing could he hear but the dunting of his own heart. He might maybe have stood there an hour, maybe 2. He minded so little, and all of a sudden he heard a laugh, and canny steer upstairs. A foot gaed and to and fro in the chamber where the corpse was hanging. Soon the door was opened, though he minded well that he had locked it. And soon there was a step upon the landing, and it seemed to him as if the corpse was looking over the rail and down upon him where he stood. He took up the candle again, for he couldn't want the light, and as softly as ever he could, gaed straight out of the manse into the far end of the causeway. It was aye pit mirk. The flame of the candle, when he set it on the ground, burnt steady and clear as in a room. Nothing moved, but the dull water seeping and sabbing down the glen, and yon unhaly footstep that came plodding down the stairs inside the manse. He kenned the foot o'er well, for it was Janet's. I took a step that came a wee thing nearer. I could got deeper in his vitals. He commended his soul to him that made keep it him. And, O Lord, said he, give me strength this night to war against the powers of evil. By this time, the foot was coming to the passage for the door. He could hear a hand skirt along the wall, as if the fearsome thing was feeling for its way. The sows tossed and mained together. Alongside came other hills. The flame of the candle was blown about. And there stood the corpse of Thrawn Janet, with a grogram groon in her black mutch, the had eye upon her shoulder and the gurn still upon her face. Right, leaving, he would have said, dead, as Mr. Soulis well kenned, upon the threshold of the manse. It's a strange thing that the soul of a man should be that filled into his perishable body, but the minister saw it, and his heart didn't break. She didn't stand there long. She began to move again and came slowly towards Mr. Soulis where he stood under the sows. And the light of his body and the strength of his spirit were glowering for his een. It seemed she was going to speak, but wanted words, and made a sign with her left hand. There came a clap of wind like the cat's fluff. Out came the candle. The saws screed like folk, and Mr. Soulis kenned that live or die. That was the end of it. Witch! Beldam! Devil! Cried. I charge you by the name of God, be gone. If you be dead, to the grave. If you be damned, to hell. And at that moment, the Lord's own hand out of the heavens struck the horror where it stood. The old, dead, desecrated core, the witch wife, say long keep it for the grave and her thrang by dills. Loud up like a brimstone spunk and fell in ashes to the ground. The thunder followed, peal on dirling peal, the raring rain upon the back of that. Mr. Soulis loped to the garden hedge and ran with skellock upon skellock for the clachan. That same morning, John Christie saw the black man pass the muckle cairn as it was chapping 6. Before 8 he gaed by the change house at Knockdoor. And no long after, Sandy Llewellyn saw him come, linking down the braes for Kilmackley. There is little doubt but it was him that dwelled so long in Janet's body. But it was away at last, and since sin the Dells never fashed us in Balwearie. But it was a sair dispensation for the minister. Lang he lay raving in his bed, and frae that hour to this, he was the man you ken the day.